On Thursday, a German newspaper claimed it had inside information about the bailout plan for Deutsche Bank, one of the world's largest financial institutions. The German government and the bank's CEO immediately denied a bailout was in the works. The news caused some to question if Deutsche Bank is the next Lehman Brothers. The bank currently faces a $14 billion fine from the U.S. government for the misdeeds that helped contribute to the 2008 financial crisis and a declining stock value that has dropped by more than 50% this year alone. Well, now joining us to discuss this from Kansas City, Missouri is Bill Black. Bill is an associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's a white-collar criminologist, former financial regulator, author of The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One, and of course, a regular contributor to The Real News. Thanks for being with us again, Bill.
Good to be here.
So before we get to the broader implications of a possible collapse of the Deutsche Bank, let's take a quick look at how we got here. Wasn't this bank too big to fail, as we were discussing before the interview started?
Well, that's why Deutsche Bank is not going to collapse. It is too big to fail, both politically and economically. And so while Prime Minister Merkel has denied that there would be any bailout, everyone in the world knows that Deutsche Bank would be bailed out by the German government.
And so some are pointing to this recent Department of Justice fine totaling some $14 billion, which is troubling because something like the total assets of the bank are something like $17 billion. Talk about why this fine was put into place, and if you think it's fair. The bank does not think it's fair.
Well, first, the total assets of the bank are more like $1.7 trillion. So it's a vastly bigger bank than you may have been thinking. And again, this is why it is, by any measure, way too big to fail. But Deutsche Bank was a very aggressive lender. It was a very aggressive player in financial derivatives, and it was at the core of the LIBOR manipulation, the largest cartel in world history by 3 orders of magnitude. And it's gotten in trouble in all of these areas. So a large part of what you see in places like Greece and Ireland, these bailouts supposedly of Greece and Ireland are really bailouts of the banks, the major creditor banks, particularly German banks, and particularly Deutsche Bank in a number of these cases. But they've also been losing money in financial derivatives, and they're not alone. So in many of these trading operations are being cut back, not because of government regulation, but because they've been so unprofitable. And that affects both Deutsche Bank, well, actually most of the largest banks in the world, but in the German context, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank. In fact, there's a story as we're talking running in the Wall Street Journal about how they're going to cut their total staff by more than 10%. So that's the second whammy that's hit them. And then there was LIBOR, where they got caught. They gave, for example, over 100 million euro bonus, so roughly 120 million US dollars in bonuses to only 2 people running this LIBOR trading operation because, and I quote, they make us mountains of money. Mountains of money was the famous phrase. And the CEO also said, what's great about this is it's guaranteed. Now, this is a high-risk behavior, so the only way it can be guaranteed is if you're cheating, which is, of course, what they were doing. And by the way, that senior executive that gave that bonus rode this supposed success of LIBOR to become the co-CEO of the company. He's been shed. So Deutsche Bank has gone through a series of senior management changes. And now this fourth one. Now, to clarify, it's not a $14 billion fine by the United States. That's simply the opening negotiation number that the Justice Department attorneys gave. If it ends up at $5 billion, it will be considered by the Department of Justice to be a huge success. So probably we're looking $3 to $5 billion ultimately in settlement. And indeed, the concerns about Deutsche Bank's precarious financial condition is one of the reasons we would be shocked if the United States actually seriously tried to get $14 billion from Deutsche Bank, because while the asset size is enormous, the capital of Deutsche Bank was already inadequate for the sum of all the reasons that I've talked about. Indeed, the Germans have been resistant to the global efforts to raise capital requirements for banks precisely because of Deutsche Bank's inadequate capital. So that's been acting as a brake on necessary reforms for some time. And all of this is hitting when Angela Merkel is very weak politically. Has been an enormous rise of the AfD party, which is this anti-immigrant, increasingly hard-right party that embarrassed her first in her home state in what used to be East Germany, and now in major cities outside in the West. There have also been losses for Merkel's party and a significant pickup for this anti-immigrant party. So all of this is coming together. Angela Merkel can't afford to have this kind of political catastrophe on her watch. And while she would assuredly bail it out rather than have it fail, if she were to have to agree to a bailout of Deutsche Bank, her popularity would suffer dramatically. Her party would suffer dramatically as well.
And I wanted to touch upon Greece. One motivation for denying this bailout is in the works for the German government is that it would be highly embarrassing for Germany, which has steadfastly opposed a bailout for Greece in recent years, to bail out Deutsche Bank, would it not?
Well, of course, in the supposed German bailout of Greece that has occurred over the last 7 years has overwhelmingly actually been a bailout of foreign banks, particularly German banks, but not remotely exclusively German banks, and their debts owed by various Greek entities, usually private parties. So, other Greek banks, for example. So, yes, it would be too explicit to have to openly bail out Deutsche Bank with German funds. And by the way, I've mentioned Deutsche Bank and I've mentioned Commerzbank. These are the really big conventional banks, but folks who should not believe that public ownership of banks is a panacea. So the German public-owned banks, the Landesbanken, have also been very bad actors in the lead up to many of these crises and have already been formally bailed out by the German government. And so Germans have a lot of scar tissue already that they don't want ripped off in the form of new bailouts, because people start thinking about the earlier bailouts as well and how furious they were.
All right, Bill Black, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.